Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Today we're looking at Vanavasi Tissa Samanera Vatu. This is in Dhammapada Verse number 75. And the story of Samanera Tissa, the forest dweller, is a good contrast to the story of Devadatta in relation to gain, honour, and praise. Tissa was the son of a rich man from Savatthi, and his father would offer alms food at their house to Venerable Sariputta. And as a young child, Tissa had met Venerable Sariputta on many occasions, and he became a Samanera at a very young age under the tutelage of Venerable Sariputta. So the story in the Dhammapada commentary tells us that at the time he was staying at Jetavana monastery, where the Buddha was residing, and many of his friends and relatives would come to visit him, and they would bring presents and offerings and all the good things. However, Samanera Tissa, he found these visits to be very tiresome, and so after taking a subject of meditation from the Buddha, he left for the forest. Whenever a villager would offer him anything, Samanera Tissa would just simply say, Sukhita hota, dukkha muccata, may you be happy, may you be liberated from the ills of life. And then he would go on his way. While he stayed at the forest monastery, he ardently and diligently practiced meditation. And at the end of the 3 months, he attained arahantship, so path and fruit of the arahant. After the vassa, Venerable Sariputta accompanied Venerable Mahamoggallana and other senior disciples to pay a visit to Samanera Tissa with the permission of the Buddha. All the villagers came out to welcome Venerable Sariputta and his company of 4,000 bhikkhus. They also requested the Venerable Sariputta to favour them with a discourse. But the chief disciple declined. Instead, he directed his pupil Tissa to deliver a discourse to the villagers. The villagers, however, said that their teacher, Tissa, could only say, may you be happy, may you be liberated from the ills of life, and asked the chief disciple to assign another bhikkhu in his place. But the Venerable Sariputta insisted that Tissa should deliver a discourse on the Dhamma, and said to Tissa, Tissa, talk to them about the Dhamma and show them how to gain happiness and how to be liberated from the ills of life. Thus, in obedience to his teacher, Samanera Tissa went up to the platform to deliver his discourse. He explained to the audience the meaning of the aggregates, the khandhas, the sense bases and sense objects, ayatanas, the elements of perpetuation of the teaching, bodhipakya Dhamma, the path leading to arahantship and nibbāna. Finally he concluded, and thus those who attain arahantship are liberated from all the ills of life and have perfect peace. All the rest will still wander about in the round of rebirth, samsara. Venerable Sariputta praised Tissa for having expounded the Dhamma so well. Dawn was approaching when he finished his exposition, and all the villagers were very much impressed. Some of them were surprised that Samanera Tissa knew the Dhamma so well, but they were also dissatisfied with him because formerly he had talked so little about the Dhamma to them. The others were happy and contented to find the Samanera to be so learned and felt that they were very lucky to have him amongst them. The Buddha, with his supernormal power, saw from Jetavana monastery these 2 groups of villagers and appeared before them. His intention in coming to the village was to clear up the misunderstanding amongst the first group of villagers. The Buddha arrived while the villagers were preparing alms food for the bhikkhus, so they had the opportunity to offer alms food to the Buddha as well. After the meal, the Buddha addressed the villagers. O lay disciples, all of you are so lucky to have Samanera Tissa amongst you. It is on account of his presence here that I myself, my chief disciples, senior disciples, and many other bhikkhus now pay you a visit. These words made the villagers realize how fortunate they were to have Samanera Tissa with them, and they were satisfied. The Buddha then delivered a discourse to the villagers and the bhikkhus, and consequently many of them attained stream entry. After the discourse, the Buddha returned to Jetavana monastery. In the evening, the bhikkhus said in praise of Tissa to the Buddha, Venerable Sir, Samanera Tissa had performed a very difficult task. He was so well provided with gifts and offerings of all kinds here in Savatthi. Yet he gave up all these to go and live austerely in a forest. To them the Buddha replied, "A bhikkhu, whether in town or in a village, should not live for the sake of gifts and offerings. If a bhikkhu renounces all good prospects or worldly gain and diligently practices the Dhamma in solitude, he is sure to attain arahantship." And then the Buddha spoke in verse, "Aññā lābhūpanisā. Knowledge is the means for worldly gain. Aññā nibbānagāminī. Knowledge leads to Nibbāna. Evametaṁ abhiññāya. In this way, with direct knowledge, bhikkhu buddhassa sāvako, the monk, the disciple of the Enlightened One, Sakkāraṁ, nābhinandeyya, does not delight in honor or respect, vivekamanubrūhaye, devotes oneself to solitude." So you can see from this particular story that Samanera Tissa is in complete contrast to Devadatta. Instead of going towards the village, readily receiving offerings in a very delighted manner, in contrast he saw the downside of it, the decline with which one could go if you take too much delight in offerings and gifts. If you remember with Devadatta, he was the opposite. He delighted in receiving 500 carts with pots of food from Prince Ajatasattu. And even when he received the expensive cloth, he immediately made it into robes and was walking around the village in a very prideful way. Whereas this Samanera Tissa, he was diligently following the path, had no apparent airs and graces, and didn't delight in worldly gains. So let's look at this a little deeper with some of the other suttas from the Buddha. In this Dhammapada verse, we can see that the Buddha references knowledge as a means to worldly gain and knowledge that leads to Nibbāna. So the simplest way of distilling that is to look at the Khattiya Sutta again, Anguttara Nikāya chapter 6, discourse number 52. And this table distills what the Buddha says in this sutta into the different groups of people that he talks about and their wishes, their quests, their determinations, their inclinations, and their final goal. If we look at the distinction between the villagers who are householders versus Samanera Tissa, who is an ascetic, you can see that the knowledge and wisdom, which is the quest of both parties, the quest is to convert that knowledge into wisdom. In the case of the householders or the villagers, that wisdom becomes what helps them to become accomplished in the world, to complete their work, to develop skills and to be able to get a good job or to run a business. In contrast, for the ascetic, that knowledge that is acquired of the Buddha Dhamma, it becomes wisdom when you practice. Your determination is to purify, to have virtuous conduct, and you don't want to acquire anything, not even gain honor and praise. And so what your end goal is Nibbāna. And so what you can see by the example of Samanera Tissa is that he took a meditation object from the Buddha. He had been taught by Venerable Sariputta, and so he was really on his task. When he left Jetavana Monastery for the forest, he would still come to the village for alms round, but he would stay detached. So he'd still have good wishes, but he would have indriya samvara, the restraint, and he would go back to the forest and attend to his task, which was realizing Nibbāna. And so after 3 months of being in the forest, he achieved his goal. He realized Nibbāna. So there's something very powerful in how you apply knowledge and wisdom and what your goal is. In the Dhammapada Verse, the Buddha references abhiññāya, which is direct knowledge. And the Buddha talks about direct knowledge usually in combination with pariññā, which is full understanding, and also parikāya, which is utter destruction, and abandoning, pahana. So an example of this is the Asava Sutta. The Buddha is talking about the Noble Eightfold Path in relation to the taints. This is in Samyutta Nikāya, chapter 45, discourse number 163. And the Buddha says, "Bhikkhus, there are these 3 taints." What 3? The taint of sensuality, the taint of existence, and the taint of ignorance. These are the 3 taints. The Noble Eightfold Path is to be developed for direct knowledge of these 3 taints, for the full understanding of them, for their utter destruction, and for their abandoning. And so in relation to Dhamma, not just this Dhamma, but many other ones, about the fetters, about the hindrances, about the defilements, Buddha always talks about having direct knowledge of them. So knowing for yourself from your own experience. And then with that knowledge that you've directly gained, to then have full understanding of them. Then after that, for the full or utter destruction of them, and then their abandoning. So that's the usual sequence. So this Dhamma is not something that sits on the shelf, that you learn it. It's actually something that you directly know, then you fully understand or realize, and then you destroy or uproot the taints and fetters and things of that nature. In this Dhammapada verse today, we're looking at the Buddha's words, and he references Aññā, Sakkāraṁ. And in our last poya Dhamma session, we looked at gain, honor, and praise. So lābhūpanisā silokam. And we looked at this in depth. And in this story of Samanera Tissa, he receives honor and offerings and things of that nature, but he also receives dishonor after giving his Dhamma talk. So when we went through our session, we looked at this Sakkāraṁ Sutta. This appears in Itivuttaka, discourse number 81, but it also appears in Saggattaka Sutta, which is Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 17, discourse number 10. And the Buddha says, when treated with honor or not treated with honor, or both, with concentration that does not shake, one dwells vigilantly, meditating continuously, gifted with subtle view and introspection, delighting in the destruction of clinging, he has said such a one is a good person. So what's very clear in this story is that when Samanera Tissa receives great honor and respect, receives lots of gifts and hospitality, he does find it tiresome, but at the same time he receives those gifts with honor. So he wishes the villagers to be happy and to be free from all suffering. And at the same time, when he eventually gives this Dhamma talk at the request of Venerable Sariputta, later on what you find is that he receives some kind of dishonor because the villagers were unhappy that he could expound such wholesome Dhamma, but all he wished them was to be happy and to be free of ill will. They didn't quite understand. And the Buddha came and praised Samanera Tissa. And the villagers, I think, after the appearance of the Buddha, they actually understood. Now, what's quite evident is that in contrast to Devadatta, Devadatta was the one who pranced around and got intoxicated with gain, honor, and praise. And in particular, he was seeking a great deal of honor, a great deal of respect, and wanted to receive the best of everything. But in the story of Samanera Tissa, the contrast can be seen. This is a particular person, a practitioner, a samanera, who isn't seeking that. And he didn't laud himself in terms of coming from a wealthy family. In fact, it doesn't seem that he brought it up. He didn't want to be treated specially or with great honor because he had originally come from a wealthy family. So there's great contrast to the story of Devadatta there. And he didn't shake one way or another. So when he received dispraise or dishonor, he didn't shake with that. He just was supported by his own practice. And it's a testament to him that he attained arahantship within those 3 months that he diligently practiced and took the meditation object from the Buddha. So what we can learn from that is it's important not to shake, even as practitioners, that as trainees of the Buddha, that we are on the Noble Eightfold Path. When we receive praise or honor because we practice well, even as lay people, it's important not to shake in either direction, whether we're criticized in one instance or whether we're praised and receive honor in another instance. It's important to dwell vigilantly. So we remember this as apamāda. So apamāda vihari, so dwelling vigilantly. And to continuously meditate, to continuously walk the Noble Eightfold Path, and to keep on the subtle view, the right view. And in that way we become a good person. We destroy any clinging, which means we destroy the craving. And in that way we become the good person that practices in accordance with the Buddha's teaching. When we look at the Sappurisa Sutta, this is in Majjhima Nikāya, discourse number 113, the Buddha talks about different qualities of a bad person and a good person. And in relation to Samanera Tissa, it's very interesting that he came from a wealthy family, but he didn't use it in a particularly unwholesome way. So let's read a little bit from the sutta. The Buddha says, "And what is a quality of a bad person? Here a bad person who has gone forth from a wealthy family considers thus. I have gone forth from a wealthy family, but these other bhikkhus have not gone forth from wealthy families. So he lauds himself and disparages others because of his wealthy family. This is the character of a bad person." So we don't see Samanera Tissa doing this. He doesn't glorify himself. He doesn't walk about in a pompous manner because he receives lots of gifts and offerings from his wealthy family and relatives and friends. Instead, he goes to the forest. Then the Buddha says, "A good person considers thus. It is not because of one's wealthy family that states of greed, hatred, or delusion are destroyed. Even though someone may not have gone forth from a wealthy family, yet if he has entered upon the way in accordance with the Dhamma, entered upon the proper path, and conducts himself in accordance with the Dhamma, he should be honored for that. He should be praised for that. So putting the practice of the way first, he neither lauds himself nor disparages others because of his wealthy family. This is the character of a good person." And this is exactly what you see with Samanera Tissa. He puts the path first. He puts the Dhamma first. He goes to the forest in order to practice well. And he doesn't have very many dealings with the villagers. And when he does have dealings with the villagers, he simply wishes them well and wishes them to be free from suffering. And so this is something that is very clear about Samanera Tissa, something that all of us can take on board. Maybe we can't practice exactly the way that Samanera Tissa does. But when we do have solitude, it is to make effort towards the path. And when we come towards the world, such as our families, our jobs, and other things, it's important to balance it, not to get too tied in. One of the things that the villagers were upset about was that Samanera Tissa, when he would see them, he would simply wish them well and wish them to be free from suffering. And he didn't really become quite intimate with the village. So, if you remember the Chandupama Sutta, Samyutta Nikāya, chapter 16, discourse number 3, and this is where Venerable Mahakassapa becomes the very good example of one who approaches families like a moon. The Buddha praises him for that. And we just briefly go over the Buddha's words. The Buddha says, "Bhikkhus, you should approach families like the moon, drawing back the body and mind, always acting like newcomers, without impudence towards families. Just as a man looking down an old well, a precipice, or a steep river bank will draw back the body and mind, so too, bhikkhus, should you approach families." So even with this first statement from the Buddha, there is danger that the Buddha is alluding to when you come into contact with families. So in the case of Samanera Tissa, he's cautious. So he was receiving a lot of hospitality, a lot of gifts and offerings when he was staying in Jethavana Monastery, and so he went to the forest. And he was still kind to the villagers. He was always wishing them well, wishing them to be free from suffering. But he saw the danger in it, and he saw also that he needed to attend to practice. The Buddha goes on when the monks actually ask a little further from the meaning of the Buddha's statement. So he says, "Bhikkhus, just as this hand does not get caught in space," so he's waving his hand around, "is not held fast by it, is not bound by it, so when a bhikkhu approaches families, his mind does not get caught, held fast, and bound amidst families, thinking, may those desiring gains acquire gains, may those desiring merits make merits. He is as elated and happy over those gains as others, as he is over his own gains. Such a bhikkhu is worthy to approach families." So in this way, the Buddha, when he waves his hand around, he's basically saying that you are happy for the villagers, you're happy with who you come into contact with, but at the same time, you're not stuck to them. There's no glue binding you, and you are not held fast by them. And in that way, I think Samanera Tissa, he wasn't somebody that was under the thumb of the villagers. He was very much about the path and about the teaching of the Buddha. And you can see that the results that he got from that was arahantship. Now, if he had become more intimate in the village, which is what we looked at in Haladakani Sutta, then he would have been caught up, he would have been bound, and he wouldn't have been able to dedicate so much of his time and effort towards the practice. Instead, he would have been more around the villages and giving a lot of teachings. And on top of that, his mind would have been subsumed with village business. And in that way, what we can learn from it is it's important to see the danger of too much contact, too much intimacy with people. If we want to develop path and fruit, then we need to make sure that we have solitude, which is what Samanera Tissa is actually demonstrating. He has solitude. In this Dhammapada verse, the Buddha talks about devoting oneself to solitude instead of delighting in honor and respect. And if we go to the Mahanidesa, there are a number of instances where Venerable Sariputta makes reference to solitude. And it's not simply the solitude of physical solitude that he speaks about. In fact, there are three kinds of solitude that he speaks about. The first is bodily solitude, kaya viveka, mental solitude, which is chitta viveka, and solitude from acquisitions, upadhi viveka. So what is bodily solitude? Here, a bhikkhu resorts to a secluded lodging, a forest, the foot of a tree, a mountain, a ravine, a hillside cave, a charnel ground, a woodland grove, the open air, a heap of straw. He dwells bodily in solitude. He goes alone, stands alone, sits alone, sleeps alone. And then what is mental solitude? The mind of one who has entered the first jhana has solitude from the hindrances. The mind of one who has entered the second jhana has solitude from thought and examination. The mind of one who has entered the third jhana has solitude from rapture. The mind of one who has entered the fourth jhana has solitude from pleasure and pain. And it goes on to talk about the formless, and it also talks about the path and fruit of stream entry, once return, non-return, and the arahant. So it talks about mental solitude in that respect. And then what is solitude from the acquisitions? The defilements, the aggregates, the volitional activities are called acquisitions. It is the deathless nibbāna that is called solitude from acquisitions. It is the stilling of all volitional activities, the sankharas, the relinquishment of all acquisitions, the destruction of craving, dispassion, cessation, nibbāna. And then ends by saying, bodily solitude is for those who have solitude in body, who delight in renunciation. Mental solitude is for those with purified minds who have attained supreme cleansing. Solitude from the acquisitions is for those persons without acquisitions who have reached the end of volitional activities. So this is a very interesting thing that has come from Venerable Sariputta. I think the first one in respect of bodily solitude is one that we can understand. It's the physical solitude that most of us think of when we think about solitude, that you remove yourself from the world and the goings-on of the world. So for lay people, it may not be going into the forest and by the foot of a tree and things like that, but what it may be that you take time out at home and you don't have so much contact with the outside world, or it may be that you go on a meditation retreat or something of that nature. And that's how you get the physical solitude. So you don't make contact with the world. And I think that's one of the things that if you continuously make contact with the world, with people, with the news, with the objects, the sounds, all those things, it becomes very difficult to actually concentrate the mind. And then when it comes to mental solitude, this takes it a step further. The bottom line is always the first jhana. And then from there you develop even more solitude. So as you can see, even with the first four jhanas, what you're actually doing is you're cutting away the things that you get enamored with, intoxicated with. And if you keep building that through the formless states as well, and then once you develop path and fruit, there is even more solitude, because you have solitude from even the fetters, depending on how much path and fruit you have realized. You also have more solitude from different aspects of greed, hatred, and delusion. And so by the time you get to the arahant, this is the culmination of everything in terms of citta viveka, mental solitude, because at that point there are no more defilements, fetters, hindrances, craving, and so on. And so when you talk about solitude from acquisitions, ubadhi viveka, this is really, when you look at ubadhi, this is really it. It's talking about the defilements, the aggregates, the volitional activities. So when it comes to all the defilements, the kilesas, you have destroyed them all. In terms of the aggregates, you see through them, and there's no more coming back because you cling to the 5 aggregates. And with the volitional activities, we know that with ignorance, it is the condition for volitional activities, the sankharas. And so with the sankharas, that is the condition for consciousness. And so when you actually have solitude from volitional activities, that becomes the end of it. And so with the end of the stilling of all volitional activities, then you relinquish all upadhis, so all acquisitions. You destroy tanha, the craving. Then there is dispassion, viraga, cessation, nirodha, and nibbāna. And so this is the solitude that the Buddha is talking about. And you see this demonstrated with Samanera Tissa. So he takes the physical solitude. So he goes into the forest. He has the mental solitude because he is working away at the meditation that the Buddha has given him. And then solitude from acquisitions is, you see that after 3 months he becomes an arahant. And so he has delighted in renunciation. He has cleansed the mind. So he has the purified mind completely. And then he has no acquisitions at all. He's ended all volitional activities. And so you can see that when it comes to honor and respect, for him it was more straightforward because he was already an arahant by the time he gave that talk. Therefore, when he was dishonored by a group of the villagers, people were talking about him. They weren't particularly pleased that he was only wishing them well, and they thought he hadn't been of service to the village. Then he wasn't moved by that. He wasn't shaken, nor was he shaken by the praise. So it's something for us to take on board, that with this practice, for us as lay people, there is a lot of challenges. We are still in the world, so bodily solitude is definitely something that is not easy. And even when we get it, like even during the time of, say for example, lockdown, say that we don't have to work and don't have to attend to certain things, it's still difficult to make use of that solitude. There is definitely a challenge like that. And there may be other challenges because we have responsibilities. We have children, or we have parents that are living with us who are not well, or things like that. It's not so easy even to take the physical solitude. And then when it comes to mental solitude, even if you have the ability to attain the jhanas, how often do you access the jhanas? And so the encouragement is always to take that mental solitude. If you have the ability to follow the insight pathway, that there are meditations that you can do, that you enjoy doing, one needs to meditate frequently on them to actually access the jhanas. We can learn a lot from the example of Samanera Tissa. He came from a wealthy family, and he turned away even from staying at Jetavana Monastery in order to go for solitude. And instead of being intimate in the village, he actually was simply cordial, respectful. And in quite a short time, he attained arahantship. And so this is quite a contrast to Devadatta in terms of gain, honor, and praise. Devadatta was someone who was overwhelmed and obsessed with it. But you can see from Samanera Tissa's example, he didn't go with that. Instead, he went with developing the Noble Eightfold Path. And so there's much we can learn from his example. So we can end the session here. Let's share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you well. Teruvan Saranai.